Before tea got dumped into the harbor, Britain had already taxed windows, gambling, education, jobs, alcohol, funerals, and even the right to stay single. This video isn't about one bad law. It's about 44 insane taxes and power grabs that slowly taught colonists one lesson: the government will tax anything if you let it. This is how a tax problem turned into a revolution. 1. The Bachelor. Tax sounds like a bad reality show, but it was real life in colonies like Maryland. The government decided that being single and happy was a crime against the state, so they specifically taxed men who refused to get married. Imagine being 25, enjoying your freedom, and the tax collector knocks on your door demanding payment because you haven't found a wife yet. They were literally fining you for having no game. The logic was that single men weren't producing future taxpayers fast enough, so the king decided to punish your loneliness with a bill. It turned the government into the world's most aggressive matchmaker and made staying single a luxury only the rich could afford. 2. The Stamp Act was the British government deciding to become the house at every casino in America. They didn't just tax legal papers, they specifically targeted the one thing keeping colonists sane, which was gambling. Every deck of cards and pair of dice required a royal stamp. And if you forged that stamp, the penalty could theoretically be death without a church burial. Let that sink in. You faced penalties so extreme, they included the gallows just for trying to play poker without paying the king his cut. It was the ultimate buzzkill, ensuring that even your Friday night game involved a transaction with the government. It turned a friendly wager into a potential capital crime and convinced everyone that George III was personally trying to ruin their weekend. 3. The window tax was basically a subscription service for the sun. The government was too lazy to assess property values correctly, so they just counted the holes in your walls. This led to the most insane architectural trend in history, where people bricked up their own windows to save money. Imagine sitting in a dark, moldy living room getting tuberculosis because you didn't want to pay the sunlight fee. It wasn't just cheapness, it was survival. The tax forced poor families to live in total darkness, turning their homes into damp caves. It is the only time in history where home improvement meant removing the ability to see outside. They literally put a price tag on fresh air and wondered why people got angry. 4. Impressment was not technically a tax on your wallet, it was a tax on your actual body. The Royal Navy had a massive shortage of sailors because their working conditions were terrible, so they solved this by simply kidnapping Americans. Press gangs would roam the harbors, knock men unconscious, and drag them onto a ship to serve the king for years against their will. It was legalized slavery with a fancy name. Imagine walking to the grocery store and waking up 3 days later on a boat to India, being told you now work for the government for free. It was the ultimate violation of liberty that made people realize their lives were just fuel for the empire's war machine. 5. The Hat Act was an economic prank that went way too far. The colonies were crawling with beavers, which meant Americans could make the best waterproof hats in the world for cheap. Britain realized this would hurt London's sales, so they banned Americans from exporting hats, or even selling them between colonies. You had to catch the beaver in your backyard, ship the fur 3,000 miles to England, have a British guy make the hat, and then buy it back at a 500% markup. It was a law designed to keep Americans looking like ragged peasants unless they paid a premium to London. It makes absolutely zero logistical sense and was purely about crushing American small businesses before they could start. 6. The Quartering Act was the world's worst Airbnb experience, where the guest has a gun, and you pay for everything. The law demanded that you not only house British soldiers but also provide them with candles, vinegar, salt, and a daily ration of alcohol. Yes, you were legally required to be a free bartender for the army occupying your town. Imagine a soldier crashing on your couch, kicking your dog, and then demanding you serve him a cold cider while he complains about your furniture. It was a massive invasion of privacy that turned every home into a government hotel. It made the tyranny personal because it wasn't just in the courthouse, it was sitting at your dinner table burping. 7. The Sugar Act was an attempt to sober up the entire continent by force. In the 1700s, drinking water was a gamble with death, so everyone drank rum because it was one of the few drinks people trusted more than water. This tax targeted molasses, the main ingredient in rum, effectively doubling the cost of the colony's favorite drink. It wasn't just a tax on a luxury, it was a tax on the only thing that made colonial life bearable. Imagine the government suddenly doubling the price of coffee and beer on the same day. You aren't just creating a deficit, you are creating a population of cranky, sober people with headaches who suddenly have a lot of clarity about how much they hate the king. 8. The Transportation Act turned the colonies into the empire's garbage dump. Britain passed a law allowing them to ship convicted felons to America to serve out their sentences as labor. They were literally using the colonies as a prison colony. Benjamin Franklin was so disgusted by this that he suggested sending rattlesnakes to England in return as a fair trade. It showed the colonists that the mother country viewed them not as equal citizens, but as a landfill for their unwanted problems. It was a massive insult to the dignity of the people living there who didn't want their new neighbor to be a convicted pickpocket from London. 9. The Iron Act was the king telling you that you weren't smart enough to own a hammer. Britain allowed colonies to mine iron but strictly forbade them from building factories to turn that iron into tools. You could dig up the metal, but if you wanted a nail, a hoe, or an axe, you had to buy it from England. It is like having a cow but being arrested for making a burger. The goal was to keep America as a primitive farm that relied on Daddy Britain for everything more complicated than a stick. It insulted the intelligence of every blacksmith in the colonies and ensured that building a simple shed required a transatlantic shipping order. 10. The Declaratory Act was the historical equivalent of a toxic ex-boyfriend sending you a text at 3 a.m. saying, "I still own you." After the colonists finally got the Stamp Act repealed, they thought they won, but Britain immediately passed a petty law that did absolutely nothing except bruise egos. It literally stated, "We can pass whatever laws we want whenever we want, so shut up." It collected $0 and enforced 0 rules, but it was designed purely to be a slap in the face. It was the king standing on a balcony screaming, "I am still the boss of you," while the colonists rolled their eyes. It proved that the government cared more about hurting feelings than making money. 11. The White Pine Axe turned the forest into a crime scene. The king declared that all white pine trees over 24 inches wide were his personal property for the Royal Navy. Agents went into the woods and marked these trees with a broad arrow symbol, and if you cut one down on your own land, you faced a massive fine. It meant you didn't even own the trees in your own backyard. People started dressing up in costumes and beating up the surveyors because they were freezing in the winter while the king's trees stood there mocking them. It was a law that turned lumberjacks into outlaws and made the simple act of heating your home an act of rebellion. 12. The advertisement tax was the British government deciding to monetize your bad luck. Under the Stamp Act, if you wanted to place an ad in the newspaper because you lost your horse or your dog ran away, you had to pay a tax on that advertisement. Think about how petty that is. You are already having a terrible day because your cow wandered off and now the king wants a cut of your misery just for asking the neighbors to help find it. It was a tax on communication and community. It discouraged people from doing business or helping each other out because every single line of text in a public paper had a price tag attached to it. They were effectively fining you for trying to solve your own problems. 13. The Vice Admiralty courts were not courtrooms. They were legalized pirate dens run by the government. In a normal court, you have a jury and rights, but in these courts, you had one judge who got paid a percentage of your stuff if he found you guilty. Think about that for a second. The guy deciding if you are innocent literally makes money only if he says you are guilty. It is like playing a basketball game where the referee gets a bonus every time he calls a foul on you. It was a complete scam designed to steal ships and cargo under the disguise of law. You didn't walk into a trial, you walked into a robbery where the mugger was wearing a wig. 14. The diploma tax was the ultimate nerd tax, designed to punish anyone who wanted an education. If you spent 4 years studying at Harvard or Yale to become a doctor or a lawyer, the British government demanded a massive tax of £2 on your diploma. That was a huge amount of money back then, roughly equivalent to what many laborers earned in a month. They were literally charging you a penalty fee for being smart. It was the government saying, "Congratulations on your degree. Now pay us for the paper it is printed on. It infuriated the intellectual elite of the colonies because it made it clear that the king viewed education not as a public good, but as just another revenue stream to be exploited. 15. The writs of assistance were the 18th century version of a SWAT team kicking down your door because they felt like it. These were blank search warrants that never expired and required zero evidence. A custom agent could smash into your house, rip apart your mattress, and break your floorboards just because he didn't like the look of your face. He could legally trash your entire life looking for smuggled goods and find nothing, and you couldn't do a thing about it. It was state-sponsored home invasion. It turned every man's home from a castle into a public waiting room for the king's goons. This was the specific insanity that made people realize, hey, maybe we need a Fourth Amendment so the government can't just raid our fridge whenever they want. 16. The Currency Act was the government banning money and then demanding you pay them in money. The colonies had no gold mines, so they printed paper cash to keep the economy moving. Parliament banned this paper money but still demanded all taxes be paid in hard currency like gold and silver. It was an economic trap. It is like a store refusing to take your credit card but arresting you for not having cash. It destroyed the savings of thousands of people overnight and forced them to barter with chickens and corn just to survive. It wasn't just a tax policy, it was a setup designed to bankrupt the average citizen while the government shrugged. 17. The Wool Act was a trade war against sheep. Britain was terrified that American wool would compete with English wool, so they passed a law making it illegal to ship wool out of any colony. If you were in Virginia and sold yarn to your brother in North Carolina, you were a smuggler. They even authorized the confiscation of the ship and the sheep if you were caught. Imagine the Coast Guard raiding a boat to seize a flock of scared farm animals. It was paranoia at its finest. The empire was so fragile that a grandma knitting a sweater in Boston was seen as a threat to national security. 18. The Townshend Acts on paint and lead were the most petty way to tax a house. Parliament decided to tax the literal building blocks of your home, including glass, lead, paint, and paper. This meant every time you painted a wall or fixed a window, you were paying a fee to London. They were taxing the view from your living room and the color of your house. It was a constant nagging reminder that you didn't really own your property, the king did. It annoyed people so much that they resisted even basic upkeep just to spite the tax collector. When a tax is so stupid that people choose to let their homes fall apart rather than pay it, you know you have messed up. 19. The Proclamation of 1763 was the ultimate "because I said so" moment from the king. After the colonists spent years fighting and dying to win the land west of the Appalachians, the British government drew a random line on the map and said, "You are not allowed to go there." It is like winning a brand new car on a game show and then being told you are legally forbidden from driving it. The British wanted to save money on security, so they treated thousands of grown men like grounded teenagers. People who had already bought land out west were treated as criminals for trying to move into their own property. It wasn't a tax on your wallet, it was a tax on your dreams. It forced pioneers to become squatters in their own country, and nothing enrages an American more than seeing free real estate that he is not allowed to touch. 20. The Massachusetts Government Act was Britain realizing that democracy is annoying, so they decided to just cancel it. This law literally banned town meetings unless you had written permission from the royal governor. Imagine needing a hall pass from the principal just to discuss fixing a pothole in your own neighborhood. The law stated you could only meet once a year to vote, and then you had to shut up and go home. They were terrified of people talking to each other because they knew if people talked they would realize how much they hated the king. It turned the simple act of gathering in a room into a criminal conspiracy. They basically put the entire state of Massachusetts in timeout because they couldn't handle the criticism. 21. The Administration of Justice Act was nicknamed the Murder Act by George Washington, and it was basically a get-out-of-jail-free card for British soldiers. The law stated that if a royal official was accused of a crime in the colonies, he would be tried in England, not America. This meant that a soldier could beat you up or burn down your barn, and his punishment would be a paid vacation to London to explain his side of the story to a judge who was on his team. It destroyed the legal system overnight. It told every redcoat that they could do whatever they wanted to the locals, and the worst thing that would happen is a boat ride home. It was legalized corruption that made the colonists feel like they were living in a lawless occupation zone. 22. The New England Restraining Act was the British government deciding that if they couldn't tax you into submission, they would just starve you. This law banned the New England colonies from trading with anyone but Britain, and crucially, it forbade them from fishing in the North Atlantic. Telling a New Englander he is not allowed to fish is like telling a bird it is not allowed to fly. They were literally trying to take away the food source of an entire region to punish them for being rebellious. It wasn't economics, it was a siege. The king was so petty that he was willing to bankrupt the entire fishing industry and let people go hungry just to prove a point about who was in charge. It was a hunger tax designed to break their spirit. 23. Taxing the almanac was Britain's way of trying to put a paywall on the weather forecast. Back then, the almanac was the only way a farmer knew when to plant crops or expecting rain, essentially the Google of the 1700s. The British slapped a massive tax on these books, effectively trying to monetize the seasons. They were charging you for the privilege of knowing if it was going to snow next week. It is the most petty villain move imaginable. By making knowledge expensive, they were messing with the food supply and pissing off guys who owned pitchforks for a living. It showed that the king didn't just want your money. He wanted to make sure you were confused about what day it was. 24. The Tea Act was not actually about high taxes, which is the biggest lie you were taught in elementary school. The price of tea actually went down, but the law gave the East India Company a total monopoly on selling it. It was the world's first massive corporate bailout. The government tried to force colonists to buy cheap tea from one mega-corporation while putting local merchants out of business. It is like the government making it illegal to shop anywhere except Walmart. The colonists didn't dump the tea because it was too expensive. They dumped it because they refused to be forced consumers for a failing company that was in bed with the king. It was a protest against crony capitalism and the government trying to pick winners and losers in the market. 25. The tobacco scam, officially known as the Enumerated Commodities List, was the economic equivalent of a friend zone. Colonists in Virginia grew the best tobacco in the world, and countries like France and the Netherlands were desperate to buy it for top dollar. But the British law said colonists were only allowed to sell tobacco to England. This meant British merchants could pay the farmers dirt-cheap prices because there was zero competition. Then, those same British merchants would turn around and sell the tobacco to France for a massive profit. It was a rigged game where the farmer did all the work and the British middleman kept all the money. The colonists were legally forbidden from getting a good deal on their own crops. 26. The Liberty. Seizure was the moment customs officials stopped pretending to be cops and started acting like highway robbers. They seized John Hancock's ship, the Liberty, not because he was a major criminal, but because they claimed he unloaded a few casks of wine without paying the duty. They towed his ship away and turned it into a Royal Navy vessel to patrol for other smugglers. It was grand theft auto on the high seas. The officials didn't just want to enforce the law, they wanted to steal a rich man's boat to humiliate him. It sparked a massive riot in Boston because everyone realized that if they could steal a ship from the richest man in town over a paperwork error, nobody's property was safe. 27. The Boston Port Act was the historical version of a teacher punishing the whole class because one kid threw a spitball. After the Boston Tea Party, the British didn't just punish the guys who dumped the tea. They closed the entire harbor of Boston to all trade. They put a padlock on the ocean. No food could come in, no goods could go out. They were trying to starve an entire city into submission to pay for some soggy leaves. It was collective punishment that destroyed the livelihood of innocent fishermen, dock workers, and merchants who had nothing to do with the protest. It was a siege designed to break their will, but instead, it just made every other colony realize that Britain was willing to kill a city to prove a point. 28. The iron slitting mill ban was the government trying to force an entire continent to live in the Stone Age. A slitting mill was a simple machine that cut iron bars into nails, which you need if you want to build, well, literally anything. Britain banned these machines in America completely, They demanded that if you wanted a nail, you had to hammer it out by hand like a caveman or buy it from a British factory. It was forced inefficiency. Imagine if the government banned toasters and said you had to toast your bread over an open fire, unless you bought official royal toast from London. They were intentionally holding back technology just to keep the colonies dependent and slow, ensuring that building a house took twice as long and cost twice as much. 29. The Bishop Plot proved that even the rumor of a law could panic every Protestant in the colonies. The British government floated the idea of sending an Anglican bishop to America to set up a religious hierarchy. To the colonists, whose grandparents had fled Europe specifically to get away from forced religion, this was the ultimate nightmare. It wasn't just about faith, it was about power. They saw it as the king trying to install a spiritual governor who would tax their Sundays and tell them how to pray. It was like the government threatening to move into your church and install a manager who reports directly to the boss. The mere threat of it united people who usually hated each other because nobody wanted the king involved in their soul. 30. The moiety system turned tax collection into a for-profit treasure hunt. The law allowed customs officials to keep 1/3 of the value of any ship or cargo they seized. This meant that the guy checking your paperwork was not an impartial officer. He was a bounty hunter with a badge. He had a direct financial incentive to find a mistake, any mistake, so he could steal your boat and get rich. It created a class of wealthy parasites who preyed on merchants. Imagine if a traffic cop got to keep your car if he caught you speeding. He would be hiding in the bushes inventing speed limits just to take your Honda. It was legalized racketeering that destroyed trust in the law completely. 31. The revival of the Treason Act of Henry VIII was a legal zombie apocalypse. Britain dusted off a law from the 1500s that allowed them to drag colonists accused of treason all the way to London for trial. This meant if you criticized the king in Boston, they could kidnap you, put you on a boat for 6 weeks, and try you in a foreign court where you knew nobody. It was a weapon of terror. It effectively stripped Americans of their right to a trial by their peers. It was the government saying, "We don't trust your neighbors to convict you, so we are going to ship you to our home turf where we make the rules." It turned the Atlantic Ocean into a prison transfer route. 32. The powder alarm was the moment the British tried to confiscate the colonists' survival kit. General Gage realized that the colonists were getting angry, so he decided to sneak out and seize the public gunpowder supply in Somerville. In the 1700s, gunpowder wasn't just for war, it was for hunting and protecting your farm. Taking the powder was like the government seizing all the gasoline in town. It sparked a massive panic, where thousands of militiamen grabbed their muskets and marched on Boston because they thought the war had started. It was the ultimate come-and-take-it moment. The British proved they were scared of their own citizens, and by trying to disarm them, they accidentally rehearsed the start of the revolution. 33. The probate tax proved that the British government was greedy enough to chase you even after death. Under the Stamp Act, taxing wills and inheritances meant you could not even die for free. If you wanted to leave your farm to your children, you had to pay the king a fee to make it legal. It was a literal death tax. The government was acting like a vulture circling a funeral, waiting for its cut of the estate. It enraged the colonists because it attacked the concept of legacy and family property, ensuring that even in your final moments, George III was reaching into your pocket. 34. The apprenticeship tax was a direct penalty on your future before your career even started. In the colonies, the only way to become a blacksmith or a carpenter was to sign an apprenticeship contract, but the government slapped a heavy tax on these papers. They were literally taxing ambition and hard work. It is like the modern government charging you a fine for getting an internship. It made it harder for poor kids to learn a trade and pull themselves out of poverty. The king was basically saying that if you wanted to have a career, you had to pay an entrance fee to the empire first. 35. The governor's salary. Grab changed the political game from a democracy to a dictatorship. For years, colonial legislatures paid the salaries of the royal governors, which meant if the governor was a jerk, they could just stop paying him until he behaved. It was a great system of checks and balances, But the Townshend Acts changed this so the governors were paid directly by the king using tax money. Suddenly, the governor didn't care what the people thought because his paycheck was guaranteed by London. It turned public servants into untouchable tyrants who answered only to the crown and ignored the very people they were supposed to rule. 36. The Quebec Act was the geographical equivalent of giving your child's bedroom to the neighbor kid just to be mean. The colonists had fought a bloody war to secure the Ohio Valley, hoping to move there and build farms. Instead, Parliament passed a law giving all that land to Quebec. It wasn't just a map change, it was a massive troll move designed to block American expansion. The king effectively built a wall to the west and said, "This is not for you." It made the colonists feel claustrophobic and betrayed, like they were trapped on the coast, while the enemy enjoyed the spoils of their victory. 37. The New York Restraining Act was the government putting an entire state in timeout. When New York refused to comply with the Quartering Act and pay for soldiers' supplies, Parliament simply suspended their legislature. They declared that New York was not allowed to pass any laws until they did what they were told. It was the political equivalent of, "You are grounded until you clean your room." It showed that the British viewed colonial governments not as partners, but as unruly children who could be silenced on a whim. It terrified every other colony because they realized their own governments could be cancelled just as easily. 38. The liquor license tax was a strategic attack on the headquarters of the Revolution. The British demanded a tax on licenses for selling alcohol, but the goal wasn't just revenue, it was silence. Taverns were the Facebook of the 1700s, where the Sons of Liberty met to plan protests. By squeezing tavern owners with expensive licenses, the government tried to shut down the meeting spots of the rebellion. They knew that if men couldn't gather for a pint, they couldn't organize a riot. It was a tax on free speech disguised as a tax on booze, attempting to dry out the revolution before it started. 39. The judicial tenure change was the moment the legal system became a rigged game. Historically, judges held their jobs during good behavior, meaning they were independent. The king changed this, so judges served at the king's pleasure. This meant that if a judge ruled against the government, he could be fired immediately. It destroyed the impartiality of the courts. Imagine going to trial knowing that the judge will lose his job if he lets you win. It made the courts an arm of the royal enforcement agency, ensuring that justice was always tilted in favor of the crown. 40. The copper export ban was another nail in the coffin of American industry. The colonies had copper mines, but the law forbade them from exporting raw copper to anyone but Britain or making their own finished copper goods. They wanted the colonists to dig up the heavy rocks, but denied them the profit of turning it into kettles or coins. It was resource theft, plain and simple. The empire treated America like a giant raw material buffet where they could take what they wanted and forbid the locals from cooking their own dinner. It kept the colonial economy intentionally primitive and dependent. 41. The Customs Board. Headquarters in Boston was a deliberate provocation. Britain could have put their tax enforcement office anywhere, but they chose to drop it right in the middle of Boston, the most rebellious city in America. It was like building a police station in the middle of a frat party. The commissioners were arrogant, lived in luxury, and spent their days staring down the locals. It was a visual reminder of oppression that stared the colonists in the face every single day. The mere presence of these bureaucrats walking the streets in their fancy clothes, paid for by tax dollars, was enough to start a riot. 42. The hiring of Hessians was the ultimate betrayal that made reconciliation impossible. The king used the wealth extracted from the same colonies to hire German mercenaries to come and kill them. Think about the insanity of that loop. You pay taxes to the government, and the government uses that cash to pay a stranger to shoot you. It was the moment the colonists realized the king wasn't a misguided father, he was an enemy general. It wasn't a tax anymore, it was a transaction for their own destruction. This act alone turned thousands of fence-sitters into hardcore revolutionaries, because you don't make deals with a guy who hired a hitman. 43. The spy fund was the government turning neighbors against each other. Part of the revenue generated from these taxes went to paying informants who ratted out smugglers. The government created a culture of suspicion where you couldn't trust your own business partners. If you knew someone was dodging a tax, you could report them and get a cut of the reward. It was weaponized snitching funded by the public purse. It tore communities apart and made people paranoid, because the guy buying you a drink at the tavern might just be looking for a payday from the customs office. 44. The conciliatory proposition was the fake apology that insulted everyone's intelligence. Lord North offered a deal saying that if the colonies voluntarily raised enough money to pay for their own government and defense, Britain wouldn't tax them. It sounds nice, but it was basically a mafia protection racket. The king said, "We won't rob you as long as you hand over your wallet voluntarily." It didn't solve the problem of representation, it just changed the method of extraction. The colonists saw right through it. It was a desperate attempt to divide the colonies by bribing them to pay up, which only proved that Britain still didn't understand that the fight wasn't about the money, it was about the freedom. By now, it should be obvious. Tea wasn't the cause, it was the excuse. These 44 taxes proved something way scarier. Once a government starts testing how far it can push, it never stops on its own. So here's the real question. Which modern tax, fee, fine, or service charge feels like it belongs on this list but didn't make the video? Be specific. Name it. And don't pretend nothing comes to mind. If this video made you uncomfortable in the right way, hit like. If you want more history that actually explains why people snapped, subscribe. This channel exists to remind you how fast normal turns into abuse.